Hello and good afternoon to everyone. This webinar today we're going to do is on social media. The title of it is Navigating Social Media, Preserving Self-Identity in a Digital Age. I want to thank everyone for joining us and participating in this recording. Everyone's camera is off. We ask that it remain off and for the duration of the recording, as well as your microphones, if they can remain muted to minimize distractions. Once the recording's finished, you can jump back on your camera, jump back on the microphone, and we'll go ahead and answer any questions that anyone has concerning this topic. What I'm going to do is we'll go ahead and start our presentation here. Let me start by sharing my screen. All right, making sure everyone can see that. All right, so everyone should be able to share my screen. I did receive confirmation that it is viewable, so that is good there. Once again, our topic is navigating social media, preserving self-identity in a digital age, right? My name is Terrell Pugh. I am a counselor. I'm also a pastor. I'm a doctoral candidate in the final stages of my dissertation in developmental psychology. So the way I approach counseling is in a developmental way. I specialize in marriage, family, and adolescence. And I use all of that to inform how I counsel, especially my Christian worldview, the belief that, or not even belief, the truth that Christ is the way, the truth, and the life. Today, we're going to talk about and explore how social media influences self-concept, relationships, and just overall well-being. We'll look at some research, though not a lot, but we'll look at some research behind digital behavior, discuss some methods for maintaining a healthy identity, and we'll look at some ways that we can incorporate this into Christianity, into our Christian values, and we'll look specifically at the framework that we've developed here called Restore. And Restore is a model that we use when we engage clients in counseling, whether in an individual setting, a couples setting, or a family setting. All right. So again, here on your screen, you'll see the objectives to understand, to identify, and to integrate, and also apply research-based interventions. All right. Well, first, let's begin by making a definition of what self-concept is. There are key aspects to self-concept. The first being identity. So self-concept and self-identity are two different constructs. Your self-concept is made up of these five elements here on your screen: self-identity, self-esteem, self-image, the ideal self, and the social self. Your self-identity, that is the part of you that you identify with in terms of your personality traits and your social roles. Your social roles being the ways in which you may interact with society. Then there's your self-esteem. Your self-esteem that's how you evaluate yourself. How good are you? Part of that could also be self-efficacy, which isn't listed here, but it's also part of it. That's how effective you are. That's self-efficacy. And self-esteem is how you feel you are overall. What is your overall evaluation of yourself? Then we have your self-image. Your self-image, that's how you see yourself, and that could include some physical attributes like your body type, your behaviors, interactions as well. But your self-image does include some of those physical attributes. Then you have the ideal self. The ideal self, this is who you aspire to be. It's influenced by goals and future-oriented things that you're striving towards, even some of those deeply ingrained desires, your dreams, your aspirations. That's the ideal self. Then you have the social self, and your social self is that's how the roles and those relationships show up in your life, or rather, how you view yourself in relationship to other people, and how other people either confirm or deny those roles. So, for example, if you believe that you're a good student, that's part of your social role because you're interacting with the teacher in that way, in that system. But maybe you don't receive good grades. So your grades don't affirm that role you see yourself in as a good student. And so those are some of the ways in which that makes up your self concept. Moving on to social media. So we know what social media is, right? It's a medium in which we interact with socially, and it's digital, and it's a nuanced way. I mean, it's been with us for a little while, but there are some nuanced things that we see happening, and some are good and some aren't. And so social media impacts your self concept or the self concept of your clients. And these are three distinct ways that self concept is impacted by the role of social media or by social media. And these are the roles that social media plays. One is with upward social comparisons, two is with a downward social comparison, and three is with a feedback loop. Now, the upward social comparison, that's when we, as individuals, or if you're working with the client, that's when, I'll just say we, that's when we compare ourselves to someone that we feel is better than us, or maybe they're better off than we are. Maybe they're more accomplished. We see them as superior. So, for example, if I'm a basketball player and I'm looking at Michael Jordan, I'm making, and I'm comparing myself to him, I'm making an upward social comparison. Okay, maybe I am a poet and there's a particular poet that I really enjoy, that's perhaps reached the pinnacle of, maybe they won the Pulitzer Prize or something, and I'm comparing myself to them. That's an upward social comparison. Now, a couple of things might happen with upward social comparisons. In some cases, upward social comparisons can serve as a source of inspiration and motivation. Okay. Seeing someone excel in an area that we want to excel in, that might push us to set higher goals and work harder. So that's a positive way in which social media might impact us. However, on the other side of that, we might feel, and you might even see this in some of your clients, the upward social comparison can also lead to feelings of inferiority and a lower self esteem when we perceive ourselves as falling short of the standards that have been set by that particular person or by others in general. It could be discouraging, and it does impact one's sense of worth. So that's upward. The downward social comparison is somewhat similar, but what happens is we put ourselves in that place of superiority, and then we compare ourselves to someone that we perceive as worse off or less fortunate than we are. Okay. When this happens, this downward comparison, sometimes that provides a sense of relief or validation, and it might boost an individual's feelings of being accomplished. But it's superficial, because in order for that to happen, you have to essentially put someone else down, or at least look at them in a downward manner, and that's unhealthy. That leads to a lack of empathy, which is something that's concerning when we're looking at how social media might be used, and if individuals are making a downward social comparison. This is why there might be a lack of empathy. Okay? So while it might help an individual feel better about their situation, and they may view themselves as more favorable in some ways, it's at the expense of someone else, and that's not good. The other thing that might come with a downward social comparison is complacency. So, for example, a person may look at someone that's less motivated, or they evaluate them as being less motivated to improve themselves or make themselves better. And then that will make them feel adequate or enough. And uh, in that way, stay where they're at and not try. But again, that's not a good thing. It's never good to feel that in order for you to feel better about yourself, you have to put someone else down, right? But that is something that's a danger of social media, and how that impacts our self concept of who we are. And then we have this last thing, which is called the feedback loop. Okay, the feedback loop. This is a continuous cycle where external feedback, like likes or comments or shares or smiley faces or whatever is out there in the social media world that people do to interact with a post or an image or a video or what have you. that impacts the internal thoughts and emotions of that person who posted whatever material that is. So when a person posts content, they might expect some form of validation in a like or a comment or a heart or a share or a laugh emoji. If that validation is not received because the audience doesn't react to it, then they may feel unnoticed. They may feel overlooked. They may feel unworthy. They may feel as if they're not valued in some particular way. And so that then creates negative emotions such as insecurity um, or a low self-esteem. And that might even be intense if a person, in addition to doing this, is comparing themselves to someone who's receiving more likes and more shares and so on and so forth. That may also lead to withdrawal or adjusted behavior. And what that means is, well, I think we know what withdrawal means, um, but I'll just say that that might mean the person withdraws from social situations because of what's going on online. The adjusted behavior might be they start to change who they are. They might begin to change their identity and concept of themselves to garner more likes or to fit a particular trend. Okay, so they disconnect from who they truly are, who God has called them to be and designed them to fit this version of what social media is telling them they are. And so that's the feedback loop. All right. And those do impact and have a role when we talk about self-concept. Now, building on this idea of self-concept and who we are, our identity, social media can create gaps between our public and our private selves. We may present a polished version online. All right. Think of that as a person's online persona. Think about like an edited photo or curated content, things that are done very purposefully and edit very skillfully. That might not align with who a person really is offline. Okay. And we also see this phenomena such as fear of missing out. And that drives people to stay constantly connected to fear and not being a part of conversations, um, or fear of not being part of conversations or missing in certain events. And these two feed into that feedback, that feedback loop. When an individual, their private life is different from their public life because of the fear of missing out, they become disingenuous and inauthentic. They become someone who they are not. And so an interesting thing, we didn't always have this word, but this word now that we have come to know as the highlight reel effect, that refers to how social media often showcases only the most impressive, only the happiest, only the perfectly edited moments of a person's life. It's sort of like a sports highlight. It's a curated snapshot that doesn't reflect the everyday struggles or maybe mundaneness of reality, right? Reality isn't always a struggle. Sometimes it's mundane. You do the same thing over and over, and you find happiness in what you do. Scripture says, in everything we do, right? We give God glory, and in everything we do it as if we were serving God. And individuals get caught in not doing it for those reasons, but doing it to fit a persona, doing it to fit a public life, doing it because they fear they're missing out on something. So these are some of the things that we see, and higher social media use is often connected to an increased of comparison and negative body image. If we remember a couple slides ago, your body image, how you see your body, that's also part of your self concept. And so all of these factors, I mean, there's so many of them, but all of these factors, they do play into our self-concept, and research backs it up. This article here that I have for you guys can go check it out. It's called Reducing Social Media Use Significantly Improves Body Image in Teens and Young Adults. This is a very unfortunate trend that we see. We see people going for cosmetic surgery, where cosmetic surgery is now becoming a trend as as a result, excuse me, because of this very topic we're talking about today. Individuals are finding their self concept and their body image being molded by images that they see on social media. And these images are edited. They're not real. They're not real images. And so, unfortunately, there's a dangerous increase in that. All right. So, I've talked a lot about that. One other thing I'd mentioned was the empathy piece, right? And so, because individuals are engaging in upward and downward social comparisons, that sometimes impacts a person's empathy. Now, I want to approach this in a very balanced way. I want us to, as counselors, to have a very balanced approach, and not always think it must impact a person's ability to empathize. Because what we see in research, there are several factors that come into play when we look at a person's ability to empathize as a result of social media. One of those differences, and I put if you look on the slide here, you can go ahead and take a look at that research. But one of the things are cultural differences. We see in American society, there's a greater focus on personal achievements, ambition, the pursuit of success. And we do see in our American culture specifically, not Western per se, because Western is some European and even some non-European nations as well, but more so American culture, the focus on that rat race, high achieving. We do see a decrease in empathy um, with how our culture is set up. So if you're working with someone who is ingrained in American culture, more than likely, social media would have impacted them or their area of empathy, lowering empathy. And so that is a factor, right? It is a factor. You do have to consider the culture of the individual. The other factor is the purpose and use. So, although the person might be uh, an American, and let me go back. So, the other thing, for example, in Europe, so studies that have conducted empathy and social media use. So, for example, in Europe or in India, among younger populations, they show different results, sometimes even indicating a positive relationship or no correlation at all with empathy. And so some European cultures and some Indian cultures, they're not impacted in this way. And that's because of the cultural messages, the messages ingrained in the culture. We have a very success, ambitious driven culture, unfortunately, because there's so much more to life. So that's one factor. The other factor, as I was saying before, is the purpose and the use. So how an individual uses social media. Some people do use it for bonding. And we do see when a person uses social media to genuinely connect, then there's actually higher levels of empathy. Okay, so that's very important to know. If an individual is using social media, um, to know that it's not altogether bad, but you do want to encourage it for that genuine connection. Okay. The other thing is we see that motivations over time, that social media, how an individual uses it over time, also impacts their ability to empathize with someone. Excuse me. So ultimately, the motivations behind social media use, whether it's to foster social connections or emphasizing self promotion, they appear to play these factors, that is, they appear to play a significant role in shaping how someone empathizes with someone. Okay. So we do want to look at those things. And when I say motivations over time, that's through a person's life cycle. As they age, they go through different points in life. And based on that, the way in which they engage with social media, that might change. It might change. And so this is important for us to know because I think we sometimes approach this as social media is all bad. And so just know that research doesn't necessarily support that. Rather, it does support this idea of how you use social media and the culture, the way the culture interacts with social media, the way in which it's used. All right. So let's get into some, well, not yet, actually. We're not going to get into interventions just yet. We're going to talk just a little bit about social media and addiction. Okay, I was getting ahead of myself, looking at my notes, and I was getting ahead of myself. But social media and addiction. How do you know if someone's addicted to social media? Right. Well, here are some signs. Right. Excessive social media use can become what we might consider an addiction. Some of us have never thought about social media in this way, but it is a thing. Some of those signs include compulsive need to check notifications or to update one's status, feeling anxious or irritable when the person is unable to do those things. Also, when they may neglect their offline task or responsibilities because they're engulfed and engorged in what's going on in the social media world. And so those are some of the signs. So compulsive checking, anxiety when they're offline, and neglect of real life. Those are the three major areas. Other signs that you might see will fall under these three categories. Okay. Some of the underlying issues that we see when dealing with individuals with social media addictions or they're challenged in this area. Sometimes it's a result of loneliness and boredom. So, for example, individuals who may have lost someone or suffering with grief, that is, you might see them engage in social media a lot more frequently or in unhealthy ways. It's also a place where individuals seek validation or belonging. Okay, that's an underlying issue. As we discussed before, fear of missing out. And then depression. And depression is an interesting one because it goes back to what we had stated earlier with that feedback loop. An individual might seek validation or belonging as a result of some depressive symptoms or depressive feelings they have on social media. But because they go into social media and see others that are perhaps they perceive are doing better than them, they make these upward social comparisons, and that reinforces the depression. Right. And so they're sort of stuck in that cycle. But those are some of the ways in which individuals might exhibit addictive behaviors and some of the underlying symptoms that might go along with why they are displaying those addictive behaviors towards social media. All right. So, yeah, let's talk about some interventions and some strategies, ways we can begin to interact with those who are struggling in this area or potentially struggling in this area. Okay. I think a lot of the content that we've already gone through, it is very significant and very useful. So go back, take a look at it, really understand some of those concepts. But let's take a look at some interventions and strategies. The first one is a very obvious one, and that's digital boundaries, right? Set up boundaries. Um, this is perhaps one of the most effective ways to establish healthier habits. It's creating this sacred phone free moment or moments. Let's pluralize that. For instance, maybe consider having a device curfew for about an hour before bed. Um, if you're counseling clients, help them pinpoint times of the day when phone usage is most disruptive. Perhaps they're a procrastinator, or perhaps um, they are genuinely addicted. Maybe at dinner time or immediately upon waking up. Those are also times individuals tend to engage in a lot of social media use. But these boundaries essentially, they help reclaim personal time. They help regain control of your time. They also reduce anxiety because you're not engaged, your mind is not engaged in that constant comparison. And they recenter an individual on what is meaningful. And what is meaningful is face-to-face connections. That's the other thing. These boundaries and these other interventions that we'll go through also help with. They help with re-engaging people with face-to-face connections. All right. So digital boundaries. The other thing, um, use technology against itself. Reminds me of the Avengers movie where Thanos, if any of you are familiar, there's a line where he says he used the stones to destroy the stones. So he used what was destructive to actually destroy itself. And so you can use social media, you can use technology to help you. It doesn't have to be something that is altogether bad. So, for example, Apple, they have a screen time function within the device. Android as well. I believe Android's their setting or their software is called digital well-being. And so there are functions that you can engage with that will help you reduce some of that screen time. And then we're all aware of apps that do that as well. Third-party apps like Moment or Freedom or Rescue Time. The objective here is to one, track how much time you're spending, but then hopefully in you tracking that, there will be some conviction, and there will be perhaps even a concern of how much time is being used on social media or on your phone in general. But if you quantify the usage and you put concrete limits in place, then the individual is more likely to honor those healthy boundaries we talked about previously, instead of succumbing to the mindless scrolling. Because in their thinking, they may perceive that they're not really using it as much. But if you have quantifiable data to track the amount of usage, they may be then more convinced to cut back. And so use technology against itself and for your benefit. The other thing is called the 60-second rule. The 60-second rule, this is a way to be mindful in the moment. It encourages individuals to adopt a mindful minute. That's another term that's used for this 60-second rule or mindful minute. And what this is before a person goes online and they hit post or share, or they begin typing whatever it is they're going to type, they pause for 60 seconds and they ask the question, why am I sharing this? Why am I posting this? Why am I engaging in this behavior? And so this brief reflection, it can reveal hidden motivations. Like maybe they're seeking validation, maybe it's envy, maybe they're feeling lonely. And so the point is to essentially the point is to um, not necessarily not post or not engage, but rather it's about ensuring that what the person shares and what they're doing is honest, and it's joyful, and it's authentic, and it's really meant for true connection, rather than something that is based on anxiety or FOMO, fear of missing out, or loneliness, or validation, or some sort of other external approval. So the 60-second rule. And if the person finds that that 60-second rule is yielding, the reason being those external things, then they're likely going to start, with your help, hopefully as a counselor, with your help, start addressing some of those core issues. Okay. And so the 60-second rule, also known as the mindful minute. All right. The next one is, and please, I do apologize if it looks a little, some of the words there might be a little overlapping. But essentially, the next one, or the next intervention and strategy, is um, identifying when you are, or your client is, comparing themselves to others. And so essentially what you want to encourage them to do whenever that language comes up, you want to remind them, don't compare yourself to others, rather compare yourself to your own personal growth and your own personal journey. And so instead of using social media as a yardstick for success, and that's what a lot of individuals do, encourage them to view their own journey and reflect on their own lives as the reference point. We don't see the behind the scenes struggles or failures in someone else's highlight reel curated content, right? We don't see that. They don't see that. No one sees that. So that comparison is inherently flawed because you're comparing to something you really can't see. By logging personal victories like your spiritual growth, prayers that have been answered, other characteristics that you've improved in, relationship successes, whatever it might be, professional achievements, whatever those things are, and you begin to compare yourself to your own life, you begin, or we begin, to measure ourselves against ourselves and against what God and who God says that we are. And that's far more healthier, and it's more accurate. It's more accurate. Um, and so comparing ourselves to ourselves, right? And not to others. So that's another strategy that you can use when working with individuals who are dealing with these things here. All right. And so now we get into what I was referring to, what I was speaking of a bit earlier. And you're going to see that we integrate this model into um, all of the things that we do, or mostly all of the things that we do. And that's because we want you as counselors to have a grounded understanding in a biblical approach, in a Christian approach to the many things that individuals face in life. And so what this is, it's called the restore model. Okay. And what it has is each letter, RESTORE, each of these letters, they mean and they stand for something. Okay. The first letter, which is R, it stands for realign with God. And again, you can adapt these to pretty much any situation. So realign with God. This means to shift from self-reliance to dependence on God for identity and for healing. So it's realigning with God. The E is examine identity. This involves identifying and breaking free from false identities that are shaped by family, society, and experiences. So we can see this is perhaps one of the main areas that we're talking about here today. Um, that's E. S is for shift focus to God's sufficiency. And this means helping the client to let go of striving for validation or insufficiency in things and find fulfillment in God's provision and his sovereignty. God is all sufficient. And so we shift our focus from what is insufficient to what is sufficient. And this is important because sometimes, for example, depression has a very heavy focus on insufficiency. And so it's believed that when we begin to shift our focus on sufficiency, that our moods then begin to change. And we see this also in psychological research as well, where we spend most of our cognitive time will determine our emotional states. But that's S. Then we have T, which is transform the mind, right? That's literally what I just said a moment ago. But transforming the mind, that's where we renew our thought patterns. We replace negative beliefs and develop emotional resilience. And so transforming the mind as it relates to what God says and who God says we are, that's part of realigning. And so you can see how all of these flow together, and all of them, they sort of, one builds off the next. Okay. Then we have overcome through grace. This point speaks to teaching others how to rely on God's grace, how to extend forgiveness and receive it as well, and to embrace personal limitations. Some of the reasons why individuals are dealing with anxiety and stress is because they are not they do not embrace their weaknesses. They do not embrace their limitations. And Paul said in, um, Paul's very own words was that he will boast in his weaknesses, because in his weakness he's made strong, because God's grace was sufficient. And so we really have to understand that concept and what it looks like when it's active in our lives. The next R in restore means to restore relationships. And that's when we seek to heal those strained relationships in our lives and build supportive communities and live in harmony. Um, that's the R. We think we can do life alone, but we weren't meant to be doing life alone. In fact, Scripture tells us to not forsake fellowship, right? To keep the Lord's communion, which is a fellowship-based practice. But that's restore relationships. And then the last E in restore is embrace peace. This is trusting in God's sovereignty, practicing self-care and living in integrity and in faithfulness. Essentially, when you have done all that you can do within your human limits and human ability, you just have to trust that God is who God is, and he is reliable, and his character is one that will always land us where we're supposed to be. And in that, there's peace. So that's the restore approach. Okay, it's a lot more comprehensive than that. But each time we do these webinars, we're going to go through this, because we want you to ground all that you do in an approach or a framework, a methodology that will help individuals who are dealing with whatever it is they might be dealing with. And so let's take a look at how we can apply this restore framework to our topic at hand. All right. So the first one, the R. Okay, the application here, realign with God. Realignment with God anchors identity in God's truth rather than the fluctuating digital feedback, and it grounds a person's thinking in God's word instead of it being grounded in a comment or a post, because people tend to ruminate on those things once they see them out there. Psalms 139:14 reminds us that we are fearfully and wonderfully made, meaning that our self-worth comes from God's design and not a uh, digital metric or something someone has posted out there in social media world. So essentially, realignment with God encourages you to practice digital mindfulness and awareness when these misalignments are happening. And so that's what we do. We realign our thinking, or you help the client become realigned with who God says that person, he or she, is. And then that goes right into the next one, which is examine identity. Okay, I can't get my word out. Examining identity encourages individuals to reflect on how their digital experience and presence and everything, how that aligns with their true self. Right. So in the process of realigning with God, first you have to come to the realization that you are misaligned, and you may go through the ways in which you're misaligned, right? What are all the things that are in a person's thought process or mind that are inconsistent with what God's word says about them? Okay. And so some other work you can do, you can evaluate some of their family influences and the cultural pressures that shape their online expression. Right? What's shaping the way in which you show up online? Begin to explore that with them. Another thing is, you may want to explore the difference between their experienced self. This is how other people perceive them. Uh, their idealized self. This is a version they strive to be online. That identity they're sort of pushing out there, and their actual self. Who are they behind closed doors? Who are they in private? Exploring those different versions of selves, and maybe even other versions of self that have been identified. That's all part of examining one's identity. And then the third point, which is a core feature of this of E, which is examine identity, And this is to take a look and actually learn about their God given identity. Okay. Learning about their imagio Dei, learning about what is my God given identity. So in Genesis, where it says that we were created in God's image, that is the imago Dei. That is the in God's image. Okay. And so through that reflection and through that learning, essentially individuals, they take those intentional steps towards becoming more Christ centered, right? And more Christ like. After all, that's what we are, right? We're Christians, we're like Christ. Then you have the shifting focus to God's sufficiency. And when this happens, what happens is you're helping the individual break free from comparison. So the upward, the downward social comparison, the fear of missing out, even, you help them break free from that. You help them recognize that success is not defined by social validation, but rather it's defined through the faithfulness in God. Solomon said that all of our duty is to fear God and keep his commandment. If we can do that, we have been successful in life. It's not about building the biggest business or driving the fanciest car or wearing the nicest clothes, or it has nothing to do with any of those things. Right? Colossians 3:23 reminds us that whatever we do, work at it with all of our hearts as working for the Lord and not for human masters. And so this essentially will encourage your clients to be more gracious to themselves and to have an attitude of gratitude towards the things that they have in life, um, to focus their who they are, their thinking on the all sufficiency of God and away from any insufficiency that they may perceive, or actually have in other areas, because the reality of it is we are not all sufficient. And thinking that we are often causes us anxiety. Then we have T, transform the mind. Okay. Um, Transforming the mind here, when we're talking about this digital identity and social media, this involves replacing those distorted thoughts with biblical truth. Plain and simple, right? Be ye transformed by the renewing of our minds. And so, very, very practically speaking, you might have to identify those negative thought patterns and those triggers that have come from social media. You might have them engage in practices like journaling down or creating a list of all of those messages, perhaps on one side, and then on the other side, put scriptures or affirmations that are supported by scripture concerning who they are or concerning those things that were perhaps said or pushed on social media. You know, you are essentially replacing those harmful perceptions with scripture based affirmations. And that's exactly what they are. They are perceptions versus affirmations, two very different things. A perception is something that exists in a person's mind, usually in the ideal state of someone's mind. And an affirmation is reinforcing a truth, reinforcing something that is based on facts. And so you might have to go through that very literally with your clients. Don't be afraid. Don't be afraid to do that. Ask them, what specific thoughts have you thought? What specific things have you seen on social media? Um, what are you comparing yourself to? You might even have them show you some of those things so that you can speak to them more accurately. Okay. And then we have the overcoming through grace. And overcoming through grace, that essentially is a reminder for individuals that healing and growth is possible through reliance on God's mercy, reliance on his mercy, reliance on his love, reliance on his grace. Okay. Sometimes individuals strive and strive and strive and strive and strive and strive, and they don't realize that there is a point you do have a limitation that goes back to the sufficiency, right? Focusing on God's sufficiency. But once you've reached a place and you've realized I can do no more, then you have to rest on 2 Corinthians 12:9, which says, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in your weakness. And so some practical steps might be learning self-compassion and accepting God's grace when that person is struggling in any area, but more specifically, perhaps with some of those social media or digital habits. Learn that, look, I'm going to know that my limit is here, and I have to rest in God. And what resting in God literally looks like is it literally will look like filling yourself with word, reading his word, actively praying, even engaging in fasting or engaging in community with other believers, sharing your weaknesses. Okay, that's a big part of accepting God's grace. A big part of that is communicating your weaknesses with other people. Your clients must know that. That's why Paul boasted about his weakness, because he understood that if he boasted about his weakness, God would be made strong when he did that. Right. Um, the other thing is practicing self forgiveness, being able to forgive yourself. Forgive yourself for being hard on yourself. Right. Extend that grace to yourself. Extend it to others as well, and how they might interact online. Um, but forgive yourself. And then, as we talked before, setting some of those healthy boundaries. The R, which is restore relationships, the application here, that might look like individuals engaging more their authentic selves, putting forth their authentic selves, which again will be acknowledging those weaknesses. But when you put forth your authentic self in these relationships, you begin to align yourself more with biblical principles. You will begin to align yourself more accurately with who God says you are and not who social media says you are, right? And so in that way, you begin to restore some of those relationships. The other thing you can do is you can actually prioritize face-to-face relationships over the digital interactions. Or I know this is not necessarily face to face, but over the phone. Sometimes individuals have gotten to the point where they don't even want to speak on the phone with people. They would rather text, they would rather communicate through email or some other written form of communication. Um, on each level, you take away the personal interaction. Um, if you only are on the phone, that's taken away. But then if you decide, well, I'm not going to talk on the phone, I'm going to text, that's taken away. And then maybe you decide, I'm not going to text, I'm just going to use emojis. And so you want to identify when individuals are taking the face-to-face interpersonal connections out of their interactions and begin to prioritize that. Maybe that means going to a Bible study. Maybe that means attending church services if they don't attend, or connecting with other groups, finding friends, hobby groups, interests, all of those things to help essentially restore relationships. That may also mean going back into their past and looking for relationships that are broken. Perhaps part of the reason why they're engaging the way they're engaging is because of those feelings of loneliness, um, or rejection, and they're looking for validation because they have broken relationships in their past. And so that's restore relationships. And then the last one we have is embrace peace. All right. So after all of that work has been done in the previous steps of the restore model, the last step is to embrace peace. And that means, specifically to this topic, that means that those digital habits, those digital behaviors, that social media use and the way in which individuals are interacting with um, social media, what that means, embrace peace, that means rest and reflection. That means teaching them how to have a Sabbath or a rest and reflection time, how to prioritize their spiritual well-being, right? And Jesus modeled this. Scripture in a lot of places says that Jesus would often step away or go away alone to pray. And so this embrace peace, quite literally. This means to create limits, to honor the Sabbath and keep it holy. And I'm not saying you have to honor it to the point where if you don't subscribe to this version of the Sabbath where you are minimizing your work, similar to how it was practiced in the Old Testament, or even parts of first century Christendom, um, at least honoring it in the area of not using your cell phone during your Sabbath, whatever that Sabbath is for you. And you can even be creative in that way. Maybe you have a job that you work on Saturday or you work on Sunday, and your Sabbath has to be a different day where you rest. Whatever it is, you have to embrace peace. God gave us the commandment of Sabbath for a reason, to engage in our psycho-spiritual well-being, and that includes your emotional, your cognitive, all of those elements of who we are, physical, and we have to know that those are important when it comes to embracing peace and breaking these incorrect messages of what social media influences us to believe. And so that's how you would use the embrace model to work with a client, when working with a client who is dealing with this particular topic. And so um, I hope you all have gained something here. We're going to uh, stop the recording here in just a moment and open up the line for questions. So once we stop the recording, if you want to go back on camera and unmute your microphone, please feel free to do so. For those looking at the recording, I want to thank you for taking part in this webinar. I hope you've gained something from it. And be sure to take a look at our website and sign up for any of the upcoming webinars that we have. All right. Well, I want to thank you again. God bless you. And happy counseling. Happy counseling.